This is Cold Start.
And the 2025 F1 season has come to an end this past weekend with a very exciting end to the championship title fight.
Formula One's 75th anniversary series was 24 races long. I think the longest season that they've ever had. And it was pretty exciting. I have to say, the racing was pretty close for most of the year. The season started out pretty strong and then went into doldrums for a while and then came back and was really an exciting conclusion to the overall series.
Yeah, I got to be honest, I did not pay any attention to the first probably 70% of the season. It wasn't until we made our trip out to the US GP at COTA that I actually started to pay attention, which maybe I tuned in at the right time because the fight for the championship got very, very interesting for those last handful of races.
I think that's how fandom goes, right? People find some impetus or catalyst that gets them excited about a sport, and then they're all in. And sometimes it takes one race that they watch or an experience they've had, maybe going to a race in person. Maybe there's a driver they suddenly sort of glom onto and get excited about. This year had the Formula One movie, F1, that was hyped for, a year before the season even started, and was made to be a huge vehicle tied in with social media and all streaming and things like that. So I think there were a lot of ways that brought people into this season, and glad you had your opportunity to get involved as well.
Yeah, I could not have imagined at the beginning of this year that I would have woken up at 5 a.m. to watch an F1 race live, but here I was this past weekend tuning in to make sure that I didn't get any spoilers from social media of who was going to win the World Championship.
I'm so excited. It makes me kind of giddy to know that you're now an F1 fanboy like some of us. I can't say I got up at 5 a.m. to watch any NASCAR this season. Not that I would have had to, but if the opportunity was there, I probably would have passed.
Yeah, that's very true. I usually tune out for a good 60% of NASCAR races anyway when I'm watching them live because they're 3 hours long, 3 times as long as an F1 race.
Yeah, and the end of that NASCAR season, that's its own episode and a totally different discussion from this F1 one. So
don't even get me started. I'm still not over what happened in 2 of the 3 championship fights in NASCAR this season. It was terrible. But yes, that's another episode.
Yeah, we'll just table that discussion for now. We'll focus on the 24 race season that was Formula One 2025. Consisted of 3 races here in the U.S. We repeated again the race in Miami and Vegas in addition to the Circuit of the Americas US Grand Prix that we're used to. And we had 6 of these sprint race format races where qualifying and the practices before the race were adjusted a little bit to allow for this additional race to take place, this short form sprint race, and allowed for pretty exciting results during the season.
Yeah, was sprint races, was that something new for this season, or is that been something that they've tried to start to implement?
They started it last season. I think they were trying to shake things up a little bit. You know, after 3 practice sessions, if you're not a hardcore fan, practice is really hard to get excited for. If you look out on the stands in a lot of these races too, it's not a good look. There's a lot of empty grandstands. The places just aren't filled up with all the excitement that you get of quali and race day. And so I think they were trying to shift some of the viewership and the engagement away from what seemed like yet another boring practice to something where it was a bit more competitive. There was more at stake. There's actually points at stake with the sprint race format versus just practices and then quali. So it made a little bit of a change, and I think it was one for the better.
Yeah, I would agree with that of going to my first F1 race in person. I think one of the big maybe negative points was the fact of the cars weren't on track that often. And to be honest, like, I understand I'm comparing F1 to NASCAR, but the benefit of a NASCAR race is if you go watch one live, it's a 3-hour endeavor, right? I mean, paying those tickets, taking the energy to go to the track, to have a 3-hour show, which, yes, to a lot of people sounds like that's way too long, maybe 2 hours too long. But when you're there live, it's kind of nice. You can roam around, you can go grab some drinks, and the race is still going on. So I can understand how F1 would want to maybe add some things to their race weekend. And for those spectators or those fans that showed up live, giving them an extra little treat of those cars being on track, because it is so special to see them in person, and a little bit more track time is always good for the fan.
Keeping the racing competitive is another thing to keep people engaged. There certainly have been seasons leading up to this one where we've had a single dominant driver winning what felt like most of the races or kind of out being in front a lot of the time, and it didn't make for exciting competition. We saw that for years with the Mercedes Petronas team between Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas just being dominant for several years. And now more recently, it's been Max Verstappen with Red Bull and that team just going out and dominating race after race and seeing Max win time and time again. It was actually starting to alienate some of that new fan base that they worked so hard to build through things like Drive to Survive and some of the other social media and outreach that they're doing for F1. So they had to be really careful about making just gentle tweaks to the format, the season, some of the structure of how they run a race to keep people engaged all season long. And it's a really long season, 24 races. There's a lot of activity going on, and there's only a few down weekends among that long stretch of time.
So looking at the season, I would say that like this season in comparative to some of those other ones, there really wasn't that kind of dominant force. So do you think it's worthwhile going through kind of the highlights of the season of like some major points of what shifted the tides to bring us to a very interesting end of basically a three-way fight for the championship?
Yeah, I think there's two different fights that happen in Formula One, right? There's the drivers' competition, which is who's the fastest driver, who gets the most points. But then there's the Constructors' Championship, which is which team has secured the championship in terms of their cars between the drivers, for the season. McLaren was definitely dominant on that front. They've been showing strong for the last season or two. Their momentum was there, and Red Bull had kind of taken their foot off the gas a little bit with some of the changes they've made to their powertrain. Their relationship with Honda sort of shifting into Ford as they're looking forward now, Red Bull powertrains. I think McLaren was definitely dominant there, and that gave strength to their drivers. We were seeing really great performances coming from Lando Norris and even some more coming from Oscar Piastri toward the middle to last part of last season that put them in a good position. But we still had the strength of Max Verstappen. We had a strong Mercedes team coming up with George Russell performing really well. We had, the specter of Ferrari making a huge amount of changes to their car. I think I read 95% of their entire race car had changed year over year, even though the regulations hadn't changed by that much. So new body panels, new aero work, new powertrain changes. We expected great things from Lewis Hamilton in his time kicking off at Ferrari, and it didn't really go that way. So at the beginning of the season, things kind of laid themselves out to be, we're not really sure where this is going yet. I mean, McLaren looks good, Red Bull looks good. There's a few teams kind of all near the pointy part of the pack that we think are going to be in domination in competition this season. And things started out that way, right? The first race of the year was in Melbourne, Australia, and McLaren dominated, and Piastri came out of the gate with his first victory of the season, what winds up being his home race as an Australian. So that wound up pretty strong, and it looked like unexpectedly Piastri took the lead when everybody was looking to Lando Norris to come out of the gate as the stronger one.
Yeah, and I mean, McLaren winning the Constructor Championship, you could argue that McLaren, out of all of the major front-running teams, probably has the most stout driver lineup of their two drivers. Because if you look at Red Bull Racing, I mean, Yuki Tsunoda, yeah, he's done an okay job this season, but it's not like you have two Max Verstappens out there performing really well for the Red Bull team, where with McLaren, you have two star drivers, right? And I think that put McLaren in a very interesting situation for the season of having almost two lead drivers, two main drivers, whatever you want to call it, of like there's the front running driver and then there's kind of like the backup driver in the team. But McLaren found themselves having to make decisions of who was going to be the favorite driver, which I think that's its own drama in and of itself of, how did Zach Brown favor Lando over Oscar? And I think we all know who the favorite is amongst the two of them. But it was definitely an interesting journey for McLaren through the season of trying to make those decisions.
Yeah, I think at any other team, Oscar would be taking the lead driver position as opposed to up here or even second driver to Lando Norris, who's been growing every year and getting stronger and stronger out there. And then, of course, Red Bull always has some drama going on with their lineup with whoever's second to Max Verstappen. Sergio had been putting out some decent numbers, but was by far paling in comparison to how Max was doing. So Sergio Perez got the boot. Then they brought in Liam Lawson, who didn't stick around very long and was swapped out with Yuki Tsunoda, who didn't make the strongest push all season long. So, things are up in the air over at Red Bull, and I think left McLaren there just to dominate. And for there to be any competition, it would have had to come from Mercedes or maybe Ferrari early in the season.
Yeah, exactly. Those two teams also have pretty strong lineups, but it definitely led for kind of this shift back and forth throughout the season of who was going to be the main guy.
Yeah, in an early race we had in Shanghai, we brought back the Chinese Grand Prix. That was the first race with the sprint race format that we did this season. And the unexpected win there, and a lot of people were excited to see Lewis Hamilton taking the victory in a Ferrari in the sprint race, sort of boding for the rest of the season, like maybe Ferrari's got a chance. Lewis Hamilton moving from Mercedes to Ferrari, maybe this is going to be the thing. This is what everybody said. He's such a dominant driver, and we think they have a good car this year. Maybe this is proof of that. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way.
I was going to say that comment doesn't age very well as we got to the end of the season.
No, not even at all. And then we got to Miami by the time we got the first victory for Lando Norris this season. Another strong McLaren performance there. We had Imola in the season again. Imola comes in not every season. Sometimes we see Monza and Imola on the same season. Sometimes we just see Monza. This year we got both. And Imola was kind of suggesting that maybe Ferrari did have something, right? We saw them with that performance from Lewis Hamilton at Shanghai, and then Charles Leclerc took the win in Imola for Ferrari this season, really suggesting that there was maybe something more to come from that team that didn't really have much to show for this season. When we got back to Monaco, we had another strong victory. Lando Norris taking the Monaco Grand Prix. Of course, that's a feather in any driver's cap to have that victory. And that by that point, we were really seeing some dominance from McLaren, right? They were taking early championship lead, starting with races early in the season as Monaco. So we knew that they were on a strong path and likely to succeed with the way things were going. Another, I think, highlight of the season back to Lando was his home win at Silverstone, right? The British Grand Prix is a big deal every year. Formula One having so many of its roots in British motorsports and of British teams and drivers. For any driver from there to win that home Grand Prix is certainly a big deal. So Lando taking that was a very strong signal for him to be victorious on the season overall, kind of taking that big win. And again, McLaren showing their dominance overall. Another interesting thing that happened at the Silverstone race, if you remember back, Nico Hülkenberg has been a name in Formula One for, I can't think of how many seasons, 12, 13, 14 seasons. He went 240 races before he got his first podium ever at Silverstone this season. So kind of exciting to see one of the drivers from closer to the back of the pack, somebody we've seen around for a long time, starting to show some success, and what a closely competitive season it was to be able to yield those kind of outcomes. Of course, we had the opportunity to get to Texas for the Austin Grand Prix on the second half of this season, the United States Grand Prix. It was a fun race. We got to see McLaren and Ferrari fight it out. And of course, we saw another dominant win by Max, right? Max started out strong. There was good competitiveness. If you look at the sort of line graph of the season, there was a lot of clustering early on where McLaren, their two drivers are really strong. In the mix was Max and George Russell, and we thought this was going to be a tight season. Then McLaren started to pull away. Max started to fade after a little while, but then there was that second part of the season strength that we really saw, Red Bull pulling out the stops and Max starting to perform like the old Max we knew and start taking victories and pole positions.
Yeah, it seemed like it took Max a little bit of time to get the momentum he needed with the team, whatever changes they needed to be making with the car. And I feel like the COTA race was kind of that big turning point where everyone started to look at the championship and started looking at, hey, this might go to the final race of the season to be able to determine who's going to win the world championship. And also was the time that I actually started to pay attention to the season. I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. And at the moment, because Max was so far behind, I was rooting for Max to win the championship just because it'd be such an incredible story of the underdog coming from so far behind to be able to win the championship would be a pretty cool story. And then obviously, if it was going to be one of the McLaren drivers, you also have the great headline of a new world champion. So either way you shake it, it was going to be a really good end to the season for Formula One.
Even more so, that underdog was the champion so many times in a row, right? 4 times in a row.
Right. It's kind of funny to say that like Max was going to be the underdog.
So that fall from grace, like Formula One couldn't have orchestrated this better, right? What they're going for is increasing the spectacle, increasing the engagement of fans, increasing their fan base, using social media, using streaming, getting programming out there, putting out that F1 movie this year. What would have been better than having the likely to be leader who's now sort of a villain in his status as the guy who keeps winning and retired to see winning, to now he's behind being outstripped by these young guns who are up and coming. And in the case of Oscar Piastri and a peer of his, somebody who'd raced with Max Verstappen from back in Formula 3 and earlier days than that in Lando Norris. So what a great orchestration of the story we started to have. And Max, to his great credit, pulled off the part brilliantly. That second part of the season, he was just dominant with so many poles and so many victories. It was starting to look like the Max of old, and we were wondering what was going to actually happen by the end of the season. It was getting really exciting.
Yeah, I don't think F1 could have asked for a better storyline than the one that was shaping up to lead us to the final race of the season, where he actually put himself in a position that there was a likely outcome that he could clinch the championship. And being able to bring those points so close together and have this three-way battle for the title, I mean, from a marketing standpoint, from a boosting fan base standpoint, I mean, many of us could have the skepticism of like, oh yeah, they orchestrated this. They dished out that penalty in Las Vegas just to make sure that it was going to be coming down to the wire at the very end to make sure that viewership was up. But I mean, for us as the fans, we got one hell of a show. So should we jump it to the final race of Abu Dhabi?
Yeah, I think that's worthwhile. Although I think we should go back to that Vegas penalty thing. So we'll talk more about it. But yeah, Abu Dhabi stacked up to be the championship of the championship. It was the final race of the year. We cared still about who was going to win because the driver championship came down to the 24th race. It doesn't always work out that way. There's been years where by October, the drivers championship was decided, and here we're going to wander our way lame duck style through a couple more races just because we can, and those are on the schedule. So it was really exciting from that perspective. It was also another one of these night races. They always seem to be so exciting, the energy so high when they're driving under the lights. And, of course, this was driving at a racetrack that was purpose designed for Formula One, the Yas Marina race circuit in Abu Dhabi, which is just a great looking circuit. It was almost designed for the photography, the camera work that could be done, the spectacle of the way this place looks all lit up at night is just a fantastic scene.
Yeah, no, great stage for the final race. Maybe not the best track for the final race. People complain that Yas Marina is not the most exciting in regards to racing. Not a lot of overtaking opportunities.
Like one overtaking zone on the whole track, really.
Right, and it does favor one style of car more than the other of how many high-speed sweeping corners, long straightaways that Yas Marina has. It doesn't usually provide the most exciting race, but thankfully this season for F1, they had an exciting story going into the race that everyone had to tune in to see what was going to happen.
And just to mix it up a little bit, as we're tuning in to watch this race, noticing in the practices, every once in a while they'll bring in these junior drivers or test drivers who the teams are thinking about. Maybe these are candidates for the future of this team. And there's a requirement in Formula One that they give a certain number of practice sessions to those rookies. So in the final race of the year, when everything's on the line, fully one of those practices was given over by more than half of the teams to these upstarts, these drivers who most people watching the races don't know who they are, or they look like maybe they're a familiar face, but they're not quite who you think they are. Like, for example, Arthur Leclerc, which is Charles Leclerc's brother, was out there as an up-and-coming potential future Formula One driver. And so it was just a little strange to see that on this race, that the stakes are so high and there's so much, at stake. There's so much here that's just on the line, and yet we're basically burning one of the practice sessions by having all these rookies out there just kind of getting their time in the seat so that they can get their super license to race potentially next year.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting that so many of those teams left it to the final race of the year to be able to check the box that satisfies the requirement by F1 for them to do that. And especially considering that Oscar Piastri had to give up his car for a practice session when he's third in the points to potentially win the championship, and he's got to gift his car over to Pato O'Ward, which for us here in America, fans of IndyCar, seeing Pato O'Ward behind the wheel of an F1 car, pretty cool. But I just thought it was very bizarre that McLaren would leave it to the very end, especially that their car was in the fight for the championship to do that.
It was super cool to see Pato out there. I got to give props there. And I think it was a strategic call by McLaren and the other teams to decide wait until this race to use that session, that potentially strategically really important session, to put their required young driver into the seat. Can you imagine the mindset? Like, you're Oscar Piastri for a second. You're thinking about going to this race. You're now looking at second. You're now third in the points. You were leading for a while this season. It looked like you were going to have your shot at the full victory of the championship of the world. And now you actually have to give up your car during a critical session to some upstart who really is there to try to take your job.
And it was awesome to see how well Pato did perform. Like, he was mid-pack, upper mid-pack, and so many people, I feel like in the F1 world, talk down on IndyCar drivers. They look down on IndyCar drivers. So it's pretty rad to see an IndyCar driver jump into one of those cars, albeit it's probably the best car in the paddock, a McLaren. It's going to be the fastest, best performing vehicle, but he was able to lay down some respectable lap times, which it's pretty rad.
Yeah, I think overall it was a pretty cool scene to see out there, and to see those fresh faces and just some different names caused a little bit of cognitive dissonance as you're looking at the last race, saying, like, where are all the people I expect to see out here? And then it was lined up for that. Then the race itself, came down to qualifying was as important as ever. We saw familiar names out there in quali. We saw a race start that looked pretty clean and effectively dictated the rest of the race, right? There wasn't a lot of changes to the order other than from pit stops and strategic decisions that had been made throughout the entire race.
Yeah, I would say that the race itself for the final was nothing too exciting. Like, there was no drama. There was the one instance where Lando had to get around Yuki, and the weaving and Lando going off track, that whole situation, but that was the most exciting thing that happened for the 58 lap race. There was a lot of strategy. You would think that there'd be a little bit more of like the undercut or overcut type strategy coming into play, but for the most part, it was a pretty straightforward race. Max was dominant. He did everything he could to put himself in the best position possible, and I think he was like, 15 seconds ahead of second place by the end of it?
Yeah, it wouldn't have even been a factor if they decided to penalize him for going off track to gain an advantage or whatever they were speculating at the time. And of course, where Yuki Tsunoda showed up in that replay, he was obviously weaving all over the road, wasn't making it very easy for Lando to get by, which was his job, to be clear. But I think they adjudicated that one correctly. For a minute, I was totally expecting that they were going to bring out the last minute, Lando Norris has some second penalty for this thing that happened earlier, by which time it would increase the drama again, because that's the kind of thing that they've done in F1. And lest I sound like a cynical fan, like, this story has played itself out in Abu Dhabi previously, right? We had that whole fiasco with Max and Lewis and the restart in 2021. And so there was a little part of me that's like the idealistic F1 fan who died long ago when they started doing some of these things a little differently than the core fans really wanted. I was kind of expecting that. There was that part of me that's like, how are they going to do this? How are they going to interfere with this one? How are they going to otherwise change the outcome to be something potentially that was more preferable? Although I think the writing on the wall was that McLaren, this team, has been dominantly successful, and they're going to get one of their drivers up there in the winner's circle this year.
Yeah, I think would agree with you on that part that, yeah, the FIA could have gotten involved to some degree, and it made this situation more interesting. But I think at the end of the day, if it's a race that's decided by some steward decision or penalty or whatever it is, that it kind of takes away from like what the end of the season should be. If we look back on what happened in the NASCAR championships and basically kind of Mickey Mouse titles and stuff getting ripped away, I'm really glad that the F1 race, even though it wasn't that exciting, kind of played out the way that it needed to, and everyone did their best, and the strategy was what it was, and the race kind of went off without a hitch and with no drama. And I think that the title went to the person that kind of, it made sense of all the efforts through the season. This was the person that probably should have gotten the title. I think Max would have been the big upset in this situation, even though I feel like there were so many F1 fans that were rooting for it to happen, that some drama, if Yuki was going to take out a McLaren or whatever the case was, like, we all dramatize and dream of that sort of finish to the end of the season. But I'm kind of glad that it really wasn't that exciting and a little lackluster, and it just kind of happened the way that maybe it should have happened given the season that we had this year.
There were several outcomes like that the conspiratorial mind kind of kicks in. You're thinking like, Yuki has a reputation for running into people and crashing cars, and it's going to come down to he's just going to sacrifice the car to do something to stay with the team, or, all this kind of stuff starts to brew. You're like, wait a minute, none of this is motorsports. They're not actually going to do that, right? But then we have in the back of our minds these things that have occurred before where decisions by the stewards, by the sanctioning body overall get in the way. They cause a disqualification for something that seems irrelevant or erroneous. Who would have called that both McLarens would have been DQ'd at the Vegas race so late in the season when they were so dominant in their win, where it had such a bearing on the outcome? I mean, that seems like it feels like there's somebody's pulling strings here. Like, were those planks really worn down by that much to the point where we had to turn over their win? And was it even relevant to the outcomes? Like, that's one of those regulations that I do hope they go back and look at. And I know things are there for a black and white reason, like something you measure either is or is not. It shouldn't be subject to interpretation, but these are the kinds of things that are the basis on which races and outcomes are being made. So a car coming in too light from fuel, or a car having a plank that's been worn down too much underneath the car because of wear, these are the kinds of things that they never want to have the race hinge upon, but yet have been so important in these previous races.
Right. And I think like that instance that happened in Vegas, I think that was more a highlight of maybe McLaren's novice in being in this position to potentially win a world championship in regards to their driver, because I think there was another incident earlier in the season where the FIA told McLaren, hey, your boards are close to the margin in which that they could potentially be DQ'd. And so they kind of got like a light warning earlier in the season. And I would say like my counter argument to that is that, yes, McLaren should have recognized that like, hey, you're in the title fight. Lando's really close to securing the Drivers' World Championship. Don't cut it so close, right? As a team, make a decision not to run your cars that low. And I think that was just more McLaren being kind of a rookie in that position, that they're not so accustomed to being in that position to fight for the championship, and just kind of like getting nervous a little bit. Like I felt like the McLaren team in their strategy and their decisions, and I mean even what happened in Qatar leading up to Abu Dhabi, that there was just this little bit of nervousness that they weren't confident in the decisions that they were making with the cars, with the strategy, and it put them in this kind of like on the heels, which they weren't expecting going to the end of the season, that they could have had this thing secured races before, and they kind of kept stepping on their own toes.
I think that's great analysis, right? The mindset of the drivers is sometimes really apparent, and both Oscar and Lando, if you just listen to their radio messages with their team, they didn't all sound so confident out there. They sounded like very timid, very unsure what might happen, not expecting a specific outcome, but rather like hoping it would get there. And then you listen to Max, and something happened with Max. I don't know if it's fatherhood or something else changed him, having won the title a bunch of times, so he feels like he has less to prove. But he seemed just so calm and even keel and confident all season long. Anytime you'd hear him on the radio or talking in an interview before the race, after the race, he just seemed like he was in an easy position. Hey, however it goes, it goes. Yeah, I wish things were different. Hey, we're looking pretty good. You never know what'll happen. That didn't sound at all like the old Max. The old Max was out there with a head full of steam, and you could basically see it coming out of his ears when he was talking. He was mad, and he sounded like he took things a lot more personally with these people who were his friends and colleagues coming up from Formula 3 and karting and all the older days of when they were coming up together into Formula 1. So, yeah, I think that really bore itself out, where the sort of feelings of expectation of those racers. Lando Norris has been in a position to almost be the winner, and we knew he was getting close. And I think in a way he was sort of the crowd favorite because he seems like a likable guy and his media presence is really positive. He doesn't get out there and get in a lot of trouble. He's not the villain because he's won so many times and seems like he represents the evil team of Red Bull and those, Austrian people who have all this money because of this energy drink, or however we characterize these things, right? Like, I think he was set up to be the likely heir apparent, and based on the way that they interact and their styles, their media presence and so forth, I think that all played itself out in a really good way. But it also demonstrated what things are like in the face of a first victory versus potentially somebody's fifth victory in a world championship.
Right, exactly. I think Max definitely has more of that confidence, and leading to the end of the season where you're close to potentially winning a title, Max has been there, done that, right? He knows what those emotions are going to feel like. He knows the mental process he has to put himself in to be steady and confident, comfortable, and ready for that next race. There's not a lot of that emotions that are starting to sway his opinions or his performance. Where in both the McLarens, Oscar as well as Lando, you kind of saw that, right? Like they were noticing that they're really close to achieving this thing. And I think both of them started to get like those little bit of emotions and that nervousness and kind of wanting it so bad, but potentially like because of those emotions, almost losing it. And even beyond the drivers, like I think the team of McLaren themselves also had that sensation where they weren't confident in their decisions, where everyone looking at Qatar when that safety car came out early in the race and it made sense. 50 laps to go, 25-25. Like it was a very easy calculation to make. And they kind of second guessed and, well, what if something happens later on? And they kind of stumbled on that decision and once again put themselves in a position that handed Max a win and made things even more interesting going into the final race. And so there was all those things that were very interesting of like McLaren not maybe being that established team that's used to winning, and now they are that team and kind of some of those growing pains and hiccups and all that sort of stuff. I think we make a nice transition here of now that we have a new world champion with Lando Norris and a new very dominant team of McLaren, and now Max being dethroned, having to give up the number one and take on a new number for next season. I think it's going to be interesting, and we should start talking about 2026 and what does next season look like, and where does the finish of 2025 leave us in moving into next year for Formula One.
All of this is relative to what was really a close pack this year. We saw a lot of the backmarker teams that never have a chance of even getting out of Q1 in quali actually having a chance at podiums or scoring podiums, right? We saw Carlos Sainz in a Williams twice on the podium this season. We saw Hülkenberg in the Sauber car get on the podium in a race. So seeing some of those things happen, Isaac Hadjar, who is not only in a second marker car or in a back marker car, the V-Carb team, right? The Visa Cash App, Red Bulls, Racing Bulls, whatever they're called this week, AlphaTauri team. We saw them, the former Scuderia Toro Rosso, podiuming this season. So it was really close. And then when you consider the fact that the pack itself was so strong, I don't know what the statistics are exactly, but how many times in Formula 1 have we had so many world champions out there racing together so that the total number of championships, won across this series of drivers was approaching the total number of drivers on the field or on the asphalt, right? You have between Lewis and Max and now Lando and Fernando Alonso, these are all multiple winning, with the exception of Lando, multiple world championship winning Formula One drivers all out there competing together. And I think if you look further into the ranks, there's at least 2, 3, 4 more totally plausible future world champions who are out there racing alongside them. I think George Russell, in the right lineup, in the right car, at the right time of day, and with the right circumstances, could be successful. I think Charles Leclerc, if he wasn't like born under an unlucky star or whatever it is, if he managed to get into a different car and different circumstances, totally plausible. I think Lewis has it in him to win again if the circumstances were right. We don't know if we're going to see that, but it's such a strong pack and more talent coming into this field. It's really exciting to think about what 2026 is going to look like. I think this year was the closest championship race that I can think of since the 2007 series, where we had Kimi Räikkönen and Lewis Hamilton, younger in his career, and Fernando Alonso all kind of dicing it up for the win and for how close that season was. And then earlier than that, you have to go back to like 1984, Niki Lauda and Alain Prost, right? So this was an incredibly close season. Formula One actually achieved what they had hoped to through tweaking regulations and the car itself, which is to make for close racing. And of course, we're going to throw it all out next year when 2026 starts. So you kind of wonder, is this a good idea to completely change things the way we're going to at this point? But we're going to do it, and we're going to find out. And among those changes, other than to the chassis, which we've talked a little bit about before, and the power unit, we have entirely new teams coming into the field. So the existing Sauber team, the Kick Sauber or Stake Kick Sauber, or whatever the name of their team is this year, is going to be officially changing. Sauber goes away, will become the Audi F1 team. So there'll be a factory-supported motorsports team in the guise of Audi. We also have an 11th team joining Formula One in 2026. So we'll increase the number of cars on the grid from 20 to 22 with the addition of the new Andretti Cadillac F1 team. And I think a lot of people are really excited to see what that team could bring in terms of capability, in terms of just the dynamics of what racing looks like in a little bit of a different configuration than what we've seen for, 20 plus years, 20 cars out there or longer. And then just to see what this new American team alongside Haas, who's been out there for a while, but nobody really thinks of them as, or is particularly proud of them as the big American team, even though they are. I think there's something about the manufacturer being involved, having the name of Andretti attached to this thing that's exciting a lot of people. So those are some changes we're going to see coming into next year. And of course, the futures of Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, George Russell. How about the upstarts? How about, Kimi Antonelli or Isaac Hadjar or Gabriel Bortoleto? These guys who are out there as rookies putting down plausibly really good performances, even podium level performances. So really excited to see what that bodes for in 2026 and just so much more.
I agree. Like, that's what's so exciting about going into 2026 is how many changes are going to happen. Not only are we adding teams are changing, but the regulations themselves are a massive shift. And one of the biggest shifts, we don't have to get into it because I think like the new power plant is unfortunate with the hybrid system, but it is going to be a new power plant in the F1 cars. And with that major change and that major shift, it kind of leaves it as a level playing field right now. I understand there's money to be spent of developing these things, so it's not necessarily perfectly level. But looking at next season, it's kind of a wild card of what team figures out the new power plant the best, right? And we saw that with the major change from the V8s into the hybrid technology power plants that have been in the cars for a long period of time of the previous generation body style, the really long cars, and the most recent regulation change to the shorter cars that we've experienced for the last handful of years. They've had pretty much the same power plant in the vehicle, and Mercedes was that dominant team. They were the ones that figured out how to make that power plant the best out of anyone. Now we completely throw that out the window, and so anyone can be that dominant team next season. I mean, Williams could be the dominant team next season. We don't know yet of who can make that better 50-50 split V6 hybrid electric power plant the best.
With the slimmer chassis, with the new manual overtake mode, replacing what we used to know as DRS, the drag reduction system, with new active aero in both front and rear of the car. A lot of these changes that are happening, like we have no idea what's going to come. And then personnel changes that go along with that too. One notable one is everybody's heard the name of Adrian Newey, who's been around race cars and especially Formula One in their most recent time, responsible for the most successful Formula One race cars of all time, takes over as the team principal of Aston Martin in 2026. So a promotion from not just car designer, but actually running that team is going to be a really interesting change to see what comes out of Aston Martin, who's been really well funded and the last few years has seen a real dramatic increase in the amount of investment made there and how that bears out for them out on the tarmac.
Yeah, I'd say I'm more excited about the regulation change in regards to the chassis of the cars. When I heard them come out with the new 2026 regulations, the main thing I heard about was that how much the car is going to change in regards to its dimensions. So it's going to become shorter and narrower, which for me, I was like, yes, like I want that 100%. Like that's going to make a more fun, competitive, agile car because I think in like the 2019s, the late 2010s, early 2020s, when the cars were so long, they lost a lot of their agility. They lost a lot of their ability to race really close together. And having these smaller cars are going to make them more dynamic. They're going to make it more exciting. The car's going to move around more. Now, on top of that, of reducing the footprint of the car, they're also revamping all of the aerodynamics on the cars as well. And they're actually reducing the amount of aero that the cars have. They're not going to have as much downforce. They're going to be leaning on the floor of the car, the diffuser a little bit more, and not as much on the wings. And that's also going to allow these cars to move around a little bit more have a little bit more action, be able to race closer together, cleaning up the dirty air that comes behind them. All good things for on-track competition. Now, in comparison, like I was talking about with the new power plant, the power unit that's going to be in the cars, that's the part that I think is going to be a difficult thing for Formula One to sell in regards of producing a good product in regards to the racing.
Yeah.
Just because there's going to be such a large emphasis, especially early in the season, of how to manage this hybrid system, which is now going to be 50% electrical power, which is a massive, massive change from the previous cars. So now there's going to be this element of racing. Yes, we've created a chassis that's going to be better for wheel-to-wheel, action-packed racing, but now because there's 50% reliance on the battery power, there's going to also be a huge emphasis on who can manage the hybrid system the best, which for me, that reduces the excitement of the show if we're all just out there cruising around, managing our battery levels. I don't need to watch that. That's not racing to me. I don't like that additional element of over-engineering things to the point of now we have to manage the power plant, not to mention how many cars do you think in the beginning of the season are not even going to finish races because systems are going to overheat or the batteries run out or whatever the case is. I mean, there's going to be so many DNFs at the beginning of next season that it'll be a little bit hard to get used to this new power plant.
One can only imagine that they're going to take some time to figure this stuff out. So I think it will be a little rocky in the beginning too, if I had to predict. At the end of this, we have new teams and energy coming into Formula One, new power plant suppliers. You have to imagine that they're going to need to put an emphasis on making that power delivery satisfactory for the kind of racing we've become used to. It would be a huge black eye for F1 to take a step backward with this big chassis change and big power unit change coming ahead, for them to seem less competitive, less exciting out on the grid, to see the result of races no longer dictated by who's the fastest or who can put down the best move, but rather who can get to the end of the race, whose car is reliable enough to make it. That used to be a problem way back in the day, and it was never the most satisfying ending to a race if somebody just couldn't get their car to the finish line. They just petered out or conked out along the side of the road because their car just wasn't reliable enough. So I'm hopeful we'll work through that quickly. And, I'm personally excited to see what kind of stuff gets brought to bear with these new teams. The Audi team, the Cadillac team, partnerships with Haas and Toyota and others. What will that bear? The Ford power plants underpinning the Red Bulls. What will that mean for Formula One? And can't we just make the best engine we can make versus handicap it or put some kind of environmental regulations on it that don't allow these teams to go out and really express the best race car that they can, but rather conform to whatever this oddly shaped envelope of requirements happens to look like. And you're penalized badly if you've not been playing in this system for several years before, knowing the politics, knowing the timelines, knowing the sort of changes to regulations and manufacturing that are occurring, to the point where it's probably limited opportunity for individual or privateer teams to come out, like where we saw Sauber. Sauber was a guy who decided he was going to start a Formula One team, just like Bruce McLaren did back in the 60s, just like a few other people, Frank Williams. But we haven't seen that come out in a long time. Like, the teams that are coming out are huge corporations with giant backing by factories of motorsports corporations or giant energy drink consortiums for some reason. But ultimately, what it takes to get into the sport in the first place continues to get more complicated. The engineering for it gets that much more difficult. So I'm hopeful as a race fan that this will yield good racing. From a distance, it's hard to see how that will be the case, but honestly, if I looked at the 2025 year package, what Formula One cars looked like, the engineering, the budget management, the adjudicating, the stewarding that was happening at races, from far, I would have been pretty skeptical too, and thinking that that would yield a good outcome. And wow, it was great racing for almost all that season.
Yeah, 100%. Like, we obviously want to be hopeful going into 2026 that we're still going to get the great racing that we've experienced this season. I think they kind of went off with a really big bang for the last racing of the previous package. And going into 2026, there's a lot to be excited about. I mean, as an American race fan, I'm stoked that Cadillac is coming in. I don't know why, like, Cadillac has this great aura of, like, it doesn't make sense as a sports car, but like you love it that it's in racing as a sports car.
Totally.
And we've seen it in IMSA, and they've done their GTPs and that sort of deal. And so like this is just like that next step. And I mean, Valtteri Bottas to be the driver in a Cadillac, I'm already a fan, right? Are they going to do well? Probably not. It's like being a fan of the Raiders. You're just a fan. Do they suck? 100%. They usually don't do pretty good.
But man, you want to wear those colors.
Oh, absolutely. So like I'm really stoked on that and rooting for that. Audi coming into the game is awesome. The look of the next generation car, I think it looks really good. And so I'm excited to see kind of all of that stuff come to play. I'm just so hopeful that it all doesn't get ruined by the bag egg of this new power plant. And it's hard for me not to look at next season for F1 like the current past season of 2025 for IndyCar. Like I feel like that's just like the ultimate precursor for what F1 could potentially be next season,
right,
which is not a good thing, right? The IndyCar season was not very exciting because of this new hybrid system that was in the vehicles that completely changed the driving dynamic of the car, its weight distribution, how heavy the car was, and changing the dynamic of the race to being overly conservative of the package to get the proper mileage, tire wear, whatever it is.
Yeah, spec chassis, spec power unit, right?
And we saw the massive dominance of Alex Palou because he was the one driver that could figure out how to manage this hybrid system better than anyone else.
Yep.
He's also a very consistent driver and an amazing driver behind the wheel.
And what team was he?
Ganassi.
Ganassi. So, like, what are we going to see from the trickle down from Ganassi, from IndyCar? Maybe that bleeds over. Now we're going to see some of those same kind of people looking at F1.
Right. Maybe they mastered understanding this hybrid technology of this 50-50 split. I don't know if the IndyCars were 50-50 split. Someone will have to fact check me on that. But yeah, it's just one of those things where like I don't want to see racing turning into who can manage the technology of their vehicle the best. I'm definitely more of like a core grassroots old school racing of like I want to watch someone just manage something that is just a beast of a vehicle of too much horsepower, not enough downforce, and you're just fighting for your life behind the wheel, and whoever can survive the best amongst X amount of laps gets to be the glorious winner, not the guy that can manage their tires the best and manage their electricity rebooting the best. It's like, I don't want to talk about those terms in racing. Like, that's not exciting for me.
You want to see close racing. That's ultimately what this all comes down to. And changes are exciting because they could yield really unexpected outcomes and some really fun ones to watch. So we're all going to watch this really closely and hopefully and try to be optimistic about it. You know, there's part of me that says like, oh man, this is all going to work out in a way that's just at odds with what they're trying to accomplish for Formula One. But if you think about what they're trying to accomplish for Formula One, it's growing their worldwide fan base. It's increasing the footprint and the duration of the schedule and the amount of marketing dollars that they can bring to bear and the amount of exposure they give their sponsors. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of dollars associated to this as much as we want to be race fans seeing the best racing we can. And they have been wildly successful at turning Formula One, the sport, into Formula One, the product. The movie that came out this year, just orchestrating to the extent it was orchestrated or not, an outcome like we saw this year. It literally went down to the final race. We had 3 racers plausibly in contention. It was a pretty exciting outcome, and we're going to make some changes next year, sure, but some of those are guaranteed to increase the marketability of this sport, bringing new manufacturers into the mix. What do you think that they're going to do with the production cars that they're trying to sell? I can't wait to see what Audi and Cadillac come out with as street performance cars in the next 2 or 3 years once they've been in Formula One, and then could add the tagline as developed by our technology from Formula One. That I'm super stoked about. And with the changes in the schedule where they race every year, something new that I'm pretty stoked about is they've been adding more of these street races, which do add unpredictability. As a race car driver myself, I like a proper road course circuit that's been made for this purpose, but I've come to really appreciate what we get out of the street course races. Next year, the formerly, for a very long time, first race on the calendar, that's switched this year and for the last couple of years to be Australia. Barcelona, the Spanish Grand Prix, is going to move to Madrid, to a new facility that they're calling the Mad Ring. And it's going to be a hybrid street course as well as properly built track. I think kind of akin to what we're starting to see in Miami and places like that, in Jeddah, I think, as well. So that's really exciting to me because those have been pretty good races and made for great spectacle. And if nothing else, don't you want to go to the Mad Ring?
Oh, yeah, it's got a great name.
And put Madrid in the mix of that? Like, what a fun time.
Yeah, I think looking at the 2026 season, only time's going to tell, right, of how these cars kind of play out, what the competition's going to look like, who's going to be the dominant force. I can assure you of one thing. I'm definitely tuning in, and I'm going to be rooting for Valtteri Bottas to the best of my ability that those Cadillacs are somewhere in the fight.
I love this process. I guarantee you by this time next season, you're going to have your fantasy league for Formula One. You're going to be betting on races. We're going to be looking at what races we're going to go attend next year. What do you think? You're going to be looking at race series to find out how you can get on the support ticket to go be at the F1 race that weekend. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. We'll take it a step at a time, but I wouldn't dismiss anything that you just listed out. Well, this has been an exciting recap to the 2025 F1 season. The biggest surprise out of anything is somehow I became an F1 fan. Of being a diehard NASCAR fan, I finally figured out how to understand the extra sophistication of Formula One.
Formula One welcomes you to the fold, Sylas. We're thankful to have you here and definitely privileged in your presence. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks, Todd. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks, Sylas. Thanks for listening to Cold Start.